That house belongs to the family, not just you, my mother said, setting down her wine glass with the specific, deliberate calm she uses when she wants a sentence to sound like generosity instead of a threat. My name is Nora. I'm 38 years old, and I was sitting at my parents' dining table on a Sunday in October, 2 weeks after my grandfather's memorial service, with a plate of pot roast going cold in front of me, when my mother said those words and I understood, with the sudden clarity of a held breath finally releasing, that I had already seen the forged deed sitting in a folder in my car. I'm an architect. I run a small residential practice out of a converted mill building in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the kind of work that lets you spend your days imagining how spaces shape the people who live in them, which is, I've come to think, a strange and useful skill to bring into a family like mine. My grandfather, Walter Ellison, built the house in question with his own hands in 1962, a low, honest brick rancher on 4 acres outside town, the house I learned to ride a bike in front of, the house where my grandmother taught me to can tomatoes on a summer stove that made the whole kitchen smell like a warm July afternoon for the rest of my life. He left it to me, explicitly, in writing, in a will he'd had drawn up 11 years earlier, back when his hands still shook only a little and his mind was entirely his own. I hadn't told anyone at that table that I'd already found the second document, the one dated 4 months ago, 3 weeks before my grandfather's stroke, granting the house instead to my parents, with a signature that looked almost right, almost like the shaky, careful hand my grandfather had signed things with in his final year. Except for one detail that had stopped me cold in the parking lot of the county recorder's office 2 days earlier. The date on that signature was from a week my grandfather had spent, according to his own physical therapy records, in a rehabilitation facility 40 minutes away, unable to hold a pen steady enough to sign his own discharge papers, let alone a legal deed. I'm not sure what you mean, Mom, I said, which was, I want to be honest with you, a small lie, the first deliberate one I told that whole night, though far from the last thing I withheld. My mother, Patricia, is 64, a woman who spent 30 years as the unofficial matriarch of a family that never quite noticed it had a matriarch until she wasn't in the room. My father, Gerald, sat beside her the way he always did during these conversations, present, quiet, letting her hold the room the way he'd let her hold every room for 4 decades. My younger brother, Danny, 31, was across the table, cutting his pot roast with unusual focus, not meeting my eyes, which I noticed and in that moment still mostly forgave, because Danny not meeting my eyes at family dinners was, by then, simply part of the furniture of who he'd become since he'd started working at Ashcombe Title, the company handling my grandfather's estate transfer. I mean, my mother said, refilling her wine without looking at me, that your grandfather built that house for all of us, not for one granddaughter to sell off for a renovation project the moment the ground's cold. Her voice had the practiced lightness she uses for things that are, underneath, not light at all. Your father and I have been talking. We think it makes more sense for us to take it over. Keep it in the family properly. I want to tell you that alarm bells went off immediately, loudly, unmistakably. They didn't. Or rather, they did, but I had spent 38 years training myself not to hear them clearly when it came to my mother, because hearing them clearly had always, historically, cost more than it was worth. Here is what you need to understand about my family, before I go any further. My mother has never, not once in my adult life, needed to raise her voice to get what she wanted. She simply reorganizes reality, calmly at dinner tables, until the version she prefers becomes the version everyone else eventually agrees to remember. My father learned decades ago that agreeing with her was cheaper than disagreeing. My brother learned the same lesson at a much younger age than I did, and learned it more thoroughly. I was the one who didn't fully learn it. Not because I was braver. Because I moved 40 minutes away for architecture school at 22 and never quite moved all the way back into the family's orbit, which gave me, over the years, just enough distance to notice things the others had stopped noticing entirely. The house was already left to me, Mom, I said. Grandpa's will was clear about that. We all knew that. Wills can be updated, my mother said, and something in the specific, rehearsed evenness of that sentence told me she had said those exact words to someone else already, maybe more than once before saying them to me. People's wishes change, especially near the end, when they finally understand what really matters. She looked at me with an expression I'd seen my whole life and had always, until that night, read as simple maternal disappointment. I'd think you, of all people, would want to honor what he actually wanted at the end. I put my fork down. My hands, I noticed, were completely steady, which surprised me, because everything underneath my ribs had gone tight and cold. What he actually wanted, I repeated. There's a new deed, Nora, my father said quietly, the first thing he'd said in several minutes, not quite meeting my eyes either. Your mother had it filed a few weeks ago. It's legitimate. Danny can explain the process, he's seen dozens of these. I looked at Danny. Danny looked at his plate. I did not, that night, tell them that I already had a copy of that filing sitting in a manila folder in the back seat of my car, because 2 days earlier, driving past the county recorder's office on an unrelated errand, some instinct I still don't fully understand had made me pull in and request a copy of any recent filings connected to my grandfather's property, and I had sat in my car afterward for 45 minutes, reading a signature that was almost right, feeling something in my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a question I wasn't ready yet to ask out loud. I need to think about this, I said instead, which was true, and also the second small lie of the evening, because I had already been thinking about almost nothing else for 2 days. My mother smiled, a real smile, warm at the edges, the smile of a woman who believed the conversation had gone exactly as she'd planned. That's all I'm asking, sweetheart. Just think about what your grandfather would actually want. Family first. I drove home that night with the folder still sitting untouched in my back seat, my hands tight on the wheel, and I understood, somewhere around the on-ramp to the highway, that the house was never really the thing this dinner had been about. The house was simply the first place my mother's carefully maintained version of our family was going to be tested against a piece of paper with a signature that didn't add up. And I had no idea yet how far she'd already gone to make sure that paper would win. For 6 years before that dinner, my life had run on a rhythm I'd built carefully, the way I build everything, with load-bearing walls in the right places so the structure could take weight without anyone seeing the strain. I had my practice, a small residential firm I'd started after leaving a larger corporate outfit that had never quite let me design the way I wanted to. I had a rental house of my own on the east side of Winston-Salem, all clean lines and good light, the kind of place I designed for other people and somehow never got around to designing properly for myself. I wasn't married. There'd been a long relationship in my early 30s that had ended amicably enough that we still traded birthday texts, and I'd stopped somewhere in the years after, waiting for the next one to arrive before I let myself feel like my life had actually started. My grandfather's house had always been the fixed point around which the rest of it orbited. Every Sunday I could manage, I made the 40-minute drive out past the edge of town, past the last gas station before the road narrowed and the trees closed in, to the brick rancher he'd built with his own hands the year my father was 3 years old. For the last 2 years, as his memory had begun to soften at the edges, not gone, never fully gone, but harder to hold on to in the afternoons than the mornings, those Sunday visits had become less about conversation and more about presence. We'd sit on the back porch while he named the birds at the feeder, more slowly now, sometimes reaching for a name the way you reach for a light switch in a room you know well enough to navigate even in the dark. He told me more than once in those final 2 years that the house was mine. Not in some vague sentimental way, specifically, deliberately, the way a man talks about something he has already handled. I had Franklin draw it up years back, he said once, naming the family attorney who'd handled his affairs since before I was born. Long before any of this. And he'd tap the side of his head. A small, wry gesture that acknowledged what neither of us said out loud. You're the one who'll take care of it, right? Danny's got his own life. Your mother's got the big house in town. He'd smile, that particular smile he had, half amusement and half something more tired underneath it. This one's yours, kiddo. Has been for a long time. I believed him completely. I want to be honest about that because it matters later. I was not a woman waiting nervously to see if a promise would hold. I had the confidence of someone who trusted the paperwork, trusted the attorney, trusted, above all, that my grandfather's wishes, clearly and repeatedly stated, would simply be honored the way wishes are honored in families that function the way families are supposed to. My mother had never loved that arrangement. I knew that, in the abstract, the way you know a fact about weather patterns without feeling the actual rain. She'd make small comments over the years at holidays. It's a shame that big house just sits there for one person. Or your grandfather always did favor you a little, didn't he? Said lightly, over dessert, in a tone calibrated to sound like affectionate teasing rather than what it actually was. I'd laugh it off. Danny would change the subject. My father would refill someone's coffee. It was, in the ecosystem of my family, simply weather. You didn't fight the sky. You just carried an umbrella. My grandfather's stroke came on a Tuesday in early June, sudden and severe enough that he spent 11 days in the hospital and then, once stable enough to be moved, 6 weeks in a rehabilitation facility called Cedarbrook, 40 minutes from his house, working with physical therapists to regain use of his right hand. His speech slurred on one side in a way that made phone calls hard and made him, understandably, reluctant to have them. I visited him at Cedarbrook every week. My mother visited less often, twice that I know of in those 6 weeks, though she'd later describe her involvement in his care as constant, a description I let pass at the time because arguing with my mother's version of events had never once, in my whole life, produced anything but exhaustion. It was during those 6 weeks, though I wouldn't understand this until much later, that the second deed was signed. I noticed things in the weeks after he came home from Cedarbrook that I filed away instead of examining. My mother started making unannounced visits to the house, more of them than she'd made in years, always timed, I'd later realize, for afternoons when I wasn't able to be there. She started referring to helping your grandfather get his affairs in order, a phrase she used often enough, casually enough, that it stopped registering as anything other than the ordinary language of a concerned daughter-in-law managing an aging parent's paperwork. Danny started coming around more too, which struck me at the time as a nice change. Danny had always kept a certain distance from our grandfather's house, the way younger siblings sometimes do when an older sibling has already claimed a particular relationship as theirs. I remember being glad, actually thinking maybe this was Danny finally growing into a closer bond with our grandfather in his final years. I didn't think, not once, to wonder what Danny's actual employer might have to do with any documents moving through that house. There was a Sunday, I can place it now in hindsight as roughly 5 weeks before my grandfather's death, when I arrived for my usual visit and found my grandfather unusually tired, more disoriented than I'd seen him even at his worst during recovery, drifting in and out of a nap on the porch instead of naming birds. When I asked him gently if he'd had a hard week, he said something that didn't quite parse at the time. Your mother had some papers. I don't remember signing so many papers. And then drifted back to sleep before I could ask him what he meant. I filed that away too. I told myself he was confused, that papers probably meant something as ordinary as a Medicare form, a pharmacy authorization, one of the dozens of small bureaucratic documents that accumulate around an aging person's life. I did not, that Sunday, think to ask my mother directly what papers she meant. I want you to notice that because it's the first of several moments in this story where I had a clear thread in my hand and set it down instead of pulling it. My grandfather died 6 weeks later, quietly in his sleep, of complications that had nothing dramatic about them. His heart, worn down the way hearts wear down after 86 years and one significant stroke, simply stopped one night in October. I was the one who found him on a Tuesday morning, when he didn't answer his phone for our regular check-in call, and I drove out to the house with a rising specific dread I still remember in my chest even now. His funeral was small, warm, exactly the kind of unpretentious gathering he would have wanted. My mother cried beautifully at it, in the way she does everything beautifully, and I remember feeling grateful in that raw first week for her presence, her competence, the way she handled the caterers and the flowers and the small logistics of grief so that I didn't have to. It was 2 weeks after the funeral, the week before that Sunday dinner, that I first heard secondhand through my cousin Michelle that my mother had mentioned to someone at the wake some updates that needed making to the house situation. Michelle mentioned it to me lightly, almost as gossip, the way family mentions things that seem faintly odd but not yet alarming. Your mom said something about the house needing to go through some changes. Whatever that means. I figured you'd know more than me. I didn't know more than her. That was the moment, sitting in my car outside my own office, phone against my ear, Michelle's casual comment landing somewhere it wasn't supposed to land, that the low hum I'd been ignoring for months finally got loud enough that I couldn't quite pretend not to hear it anymore. 2 days later, on an unrelated errand, I drove past the county recorder's office and on an impulse I still can't fully explain except to say that something in me had finally stopped accepting reassurance at face value. I went inside and asked for any recent filings connected to my grandfather's property address. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever had a moment where a small, ordinary decision, pulling into a parking lot you didn't plan to pull into, asking a question you didn't plan to ask, ends up being the hinge your whole life turns on afterward, you know exactly what that felt like. I wasn't investigating anything, not consciously. I was just finally tired of not knowing. What the clerk handed me across the counter was a deed dated 4 months earlier, 3 weeks before my grandfather's stroke, or so it claimed, transferring full ownership of the property from Walter Ellison to Gerald and Patricia Ellison. My father and my mother signed and notarized, complete with a signature that looked, at a glance, entirely plausible. I sat in my car in that parking lot for 45 minutes. Because here is the thing about my grandfather's handwriting in his final year. I had watched it change slowly, month by month, as the small tremor in his right hand deepened into something more pronounced. I had watched him sign birthday cards, checks, the crossword puzzle he still did every morning out of stubbornness more than pleasure. I knew that signature the way you know a voice, not consciously, not something I could have described in words, but something I would recognize instantly if it wasn't right. This signature was almost right. Almost close enough that I might have believed it, if I hadn't also, that same week, remembered something my grandfather had once mentioned about papers he didn't remember signing, and if I hadn't, sitting in that parking lot, pulled up on my phone the discharge and treatment records I still had saved from Cedarbrook, the ones I'd kept because I was the one managing his medical paperwork during those 6 weeks. The date on the deed fell squarely within a stretch of days when my grandfather's own physical therapy notes described his right hand as having minimal functional grip strength and significant difficulty with fine motor tasks including writing. He could not, according to his own medical records, have signed his name legibly on that date. He had been at Cedarbrook that entire week, 40 minutes from the property, in a facility with staff who logged his location and condition hour by hour. Someone had signed for him, or someone had gotten him to sign something in a moment he wouldn't remember clearly enough to question, during a week when his mind and body were both, by every medical account, at their most compromised. I drove home that evening not knowing yet which of those two possibilities was true, only knowing, with a certainty that settled into my chest like something cold and permanent, that I was no longer looking at a family disagreement about an inheritance. I was looking at something that had a paper trail, a timeline, and I understood with a kind of vertigo I hadn't felt since the night I found my grandfather evidence. I didn't tell anyone that week. Not my closest friend, not even, at first, myself. In any words, I let myself think clearly. I simply drove to that Sunday dinner 2 weeks later with a folder in my back seat, and sat across the table from my mother while she told me the house belonged to the family, and understood, watching her pour her wine with that same rehearsed calm, that she had absolutely no idea I had already seen what she'd done. I didn't sleep much that week. Not the dramatic, tossing and turning kind of sleeplessness, something quieter and more corrosive, where I'd wake at 3 or 4 in the morning with my mind already running through the same handful of facts, rearranging them like furniture that never quite fit the room no matter which wall I put it against. I started keeping notes. Not anywhere dramatic, just a running document on my laptop, dates and small details, the kind of file I'd normally keep for a construction timeline. The date of the deed. The dates of Cedarbrook's treatment notes. The date Michelle mentioned the wake conversation. I laid them next to each other and found, each time, that they refused to make the innocent shape I kept trying to force them into. The first person I told, 3 days after the dinner, was my closest friend from architecture school, Priya, who now practiced land use law 40 minutes away in Greensboro. I called her on a Wednesday evening, sitting in my car in my own driveway because I couldn't quite bring myself to say the words inside my house yet, as if saying them out loud in that particular space would make them permanently true. "Send me what you have," she said, after I'd gotten through the shape of it, her voice gone into the careful, clipped register she used for actual legal problems rather than friendly advice. "Don't do anything yet. Don't confront anyone. Just send me the deed and whatever medical records you're comfortable sharing, and let me look at it properly before you do anything that can't be undone." I sent her the file that night. She called back 2 days later, and the carefulness in her voice had deepened into something I recognized, uncomfortably, as concern not just for the legal situation but for me specifically. "Nora, I'm not your family law attorney, and you'll need one of those, not me. But as a friend, this doesn't look like a clerical error. A deed signed during a documented week of significantly impaired fine motor function, notarized without, as far as I can tell from the recorder's copy, any second witness present, filed quietly a few weeks before he passed. I've seen enough of these over the years to tell you this has the shape of something that was deliberately timed." "Deliberately timed by who?" I said, though I think I already knew the answer and simply needed to hear someone else say it first. "That's what you need a real answer to before you do anything else," Priya said. "Who had access to him during that stay?" Who was present? Whose name is on the notarization? I looked that night. The notary's name on the deed was one I didn't recognize immediately, Carla Whitfield, but a search took less than 10 minutes to place her. A notary public who worked, according to her own public listing, out of Ashcombe Title, the same company where my brother had been employed for the past 2 years. I sat with that information for a long time before I let myself fully feel what it meant. I want to pause here for a moment because if you've ever had to consider seriously for the first time that someone in your own family might have helped orchestrate something against you, not through malice exactly, but through the particular gravity that pulls people toward whoever holds the most power in a room, you understand something about the specific ache of that realization. It isn't the sharp pain of an enemy's betrayal. It's duller and it goes down deeper because it asks you to reconsider not just what happened, but who someone has always actually been. I didn't confront Danny that week. I told myself it was strategy, that I needed more information before I said anything to anyone, that tipping my hand too early could give them time to cover further tracks. That was true. But there was another reason underneath it, one I'm less proud of. Some part of me was still hoping, right up until I couldn't hope it any longer, that Danny's name showing up in this story was coincidence rather than participation. I wanted badly for there to be an innocent explanation. I was the one who had raised him in a lot of the ways that mattered when our parents worked long hours through our childhood. I was 12 when he was 5, old enough to walk him to the bus stop, help with his homework, be the one he called first when something went wrong. Considering that he might have helped forge my grandfather's signature felt less like solving a mystery, and more like performing an amputation on my own history. The following Sunday, I did something I'd never once done in 6 years of visiting my grandfather's house. I went out there alone without telling my mother, and let myself in with the spare key I still kept on my ring, and I sat in his kitchen for an hour, doing nothing in particular, just being in the space, trying to feel whether the walls held any answer the paperwork didn't. What I found instead, going through a drawer in his study I'd never had reason to open before, was a small spiral notebook, the kind he'd kept for decades to jot down bird sightings and crossword clues and the occasional grocery list. Near the back, in handwriting that was unmistakably his, shakier than it had been years earlier, but genuinely recognizably his, was an entry from 8 months before his stroke. Told Franklin, house stays with Nora, no changes. P. Asked again about it at dinner Sunday. Told her the same thing I've told her for years. I sat in that kitchen and cried for the first time since the funeral, not for him exactly, though certainly also for him, but for the specific quiet vindication of finding, in his own hand, proof that he had known his own mind clearly enough to write it down, that whatever confusion had produced a signature 4 months before his death, it had not come from any genuine change of heart. I photographed the page. I did not take the notebook. Some instinct told me to leave it exactly where it was, in case it mattered later that I hadn't disturbed anything, in case someone might one day need to find it themselves undisturbed the way I had. I want to stop again here because this is the moment I need you to understand something about myself that I'm not proud of, but that's honest. Reading that notebook entry I had for about 30 seconds the overwhelming urge to call my mother immediately and read it to her over the phone, to win right then decisively before I'd built anything solid enough to survive her response. I actually had my phone in my hand. I got as far as opening her contact. I didn't call. I want to say it was wisdom that stopped me. It was closer to exhaustion, a bone-deep recognition that if I called her in that raw, triumphant state, she would find some way to turn even this discovery into a conversation about my tone, my timing, my unfairness in ambushing her instead of trusting her to explain. I had watched her do it my entire life. I put the phone down and instead I called Priya, and told her what I'd found, and let her talk me through slowly, methodically, what building an actual case would require instead of a single satisfying phone call. You need 3 things, Priya said. You need a handwriting expert to formally examine the signature against verified samples from before and after his stroke. You need his full medical records from that window obtained properly, not just what you happen to save. And you need to find out exactly what Danny's role was, whether he processed this filing himself, whether he simply looked the other way, or whether he genuinely didn't know. That last part felt to me like the hardest one. I found my opening 2 weeks later, almost by accident, at Danny's own apartment, where I'd gone under the pretense of returning a ladder I'd borrowed from him the previous spring. A visit I'd engineered, if I'm honest, specifically to see his face when I mentioned the estate in passing, to watch whether anything in him gave way. He was distracted the entire visit in a way I initially read as ordinary work stress. He checked his phone 3 times in 20 minutes. When I mentioned casually that I'd been going through some of Grandpa's old paperwork, his hand, reaching for his coffee mug, stopped for just a half-second too long before completing the motion. A small thing, the kind of thing you'd never notice unless you were already looking for it. Unless you'd spent your whole life learning to read the smallest shifts in the people you love. Yeah, he said. Anything interesting? Just old stuff, I said. You know how he was about keeping things. Danny nodded too quickly and changed the subject to a work deadline, and I drove home that night with a knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the particular specific dread of watching someone you love flinch at exactly the wrong moment. I want to stop here for a second because if you've ever watched someone you helped raise flinch at exactly the wrong question, you know that particular kind of pressure in your chest, the one that has nothing to do with anger yet and everything to do with grief arriving early, before you've even confirmed what you're grieving. The following 3 weeks became, in my memory now, a strange double life. By day I ran my practice as though nothing had changed, client meetings, permit reviews, a kitchen renovation for a young couple in Ardmore that I threw myself into with more focus than it probably required, because focusing on someone else's floor plan was easier than sitting with my own. By night I built a case. Priya connected me with a forensic document examiner named Howard Reyes, a retired postal inspector who now did private handwriting analysis work out of an office that smelled like old paper and printer toner. I brought him everything: the deed, a stack of verified samples of my grandfather's signature spanning the last 3 years of his life, including several from the exact month of the forged document, pulled from pharmacy pickup logs, and a birthday card he'd signed for Ava, my niece, the week before his stroke. Howard spent 2 weeks with the samples before calling me in. He laid the documents side by side under a lit magnifier and walked me through what he called the tremor signature, the specific, consistent pattern of micro-hesitations in my grandfather's late-stage handwriting, the particular way his pen lifted slightly before the downstroke of a W, a habit that had been present in every single verified sample from the final 18 months of his life. This, he said, tapping the deed, doesn't have it. It's a good approximation. Whoever did this studied his signature carefully, probably from other documents, cards, checks. But it's too smooth in the wrong places and too shaky in the wrong places. It's not a natural tremor. It's someone imitating one. He looked at me directly. I can testify to that in court if it comes to that. I'd put my name behind this finding. I obtained, through a formal medical records request that Priya helped me file, the complete treatment log from Cedarbrook for the exact week the deed was dated. The notes were unambiguous. Occupational therapy sessions documenting significant right hand tremor, grip strength measured at February 5th, patient unable to complete fine motor tasks including buttoning a shirt or holding a pen for more than a few seconds without assistance. A nurse's note from that same week mentioned, almost in passing, that patient's daughter-in-law visited, requested to speak with patient privately for approximately 20 minutes. Patricia, my mother, alone with him for 20 minutes during the exact window his own medical team was documenting as his weakest. I did not yet have proof of what happened in that room. But I had, by that point, 3 converging facts that no longer looked like coincidence: a signature that a certified expert said was imitated rather than genuine, a medical record proving physical incapacity during the signing window, and a visit log placing my mother alone with him at precisely that time. What I didn't yet have was Danny's role, or the full shape of what Ashcombe Title had actually done with the paperwork, whether the notarization had been performed properly, in person, or simply rubber-stamped as a professional favor. I found the answer to that by accident, in a way I hadn't engineered and couldn't have predicted, 3 days before Thanksgiving. I'd gone to Ashcombe Title's office in person, not to confront anyone, only to request, as any member of the public is entitled to, a certified copy of the notarization log for that specific filing, the kind of routine document request Priya had told me any title company is required to produce on file. I sat in the small waiting area while the front desk clerk searched the archive, and Danny walked out of a back office with a stack of folders, stopping dead when he saw me. "Nora, what are you doing here?" "Just some paperwork," I said, which by then had become something close to a reflex, the same vague deflection my whole family seemed to specialize in. He didn't ask what paperwork. That, more than anything else, told me what I needed to know. A brother with nothing to hide would have asked. Instead he stood there for a long moment, folders pressed against his chest like something he could hide behind, and something in his face did the thing I'd been dreading and half expecting for weeks. It cracked just slightly, just at the edges, before he caught himself and smoothed it back into professional neutrality. "I have to get back," he said, and walked away without another word. The clerk returned a few minutes later with the notarization log. It confirmed what Howard's analysis had already suggested. The notarization had been logged as an in-office signing, on a date when Cedarbrook's own visitor log showed no record of anyone from Ashcombe Title having visited the facility. Someone had notarized a signature that, according to every physical record available, had not been performed where the document claimed it had been performed. I sat in my car in that parking lot for the second time in 2 months, holding a piece of paper that finally, completely, closed the loop between my mother's 20-minute private visit and a legal document that made her and my father the legal owners of my grandfather's house. I did not confront anyone that week. I made a decision instead, one I'm still not entirely at peace with, though I understand now why I made it, to sit on everything I had until I could bring it forward in a setting where it couldn't be quietly managed, softened, or reframed the way my mother had spent 30 years reframing every uncomfortable fact that threatened her version of our family. I told Priya I wanted to wait until after Thanksgiving, which fell that year at my parents' house. The whole family gathered in one room for the first time since the funeral. She thought it was a reasonable, even a strategic choice, better to have everyone present, better not to tip anyone off before I had the full picture. What I didn't say to her, because I hadn't fully admitted it to myself yet, was that some part of me also simply needed one more holiday where I could pretend, for a few hours, that I hadn't yet lost the family I thought I had. Thanksgiving at my parents' house had always followed the same choreography, my mother directing the kitchen like a small, benevolent general, my father carving the turkey with the same careful, slightly nervous precision he brought to everything involving an audience, Danny arriving late with whatever bottle of wine he'd grabbed at the last minute, my niece Ava, 9 years old, tearing through the house in the particular unbothered joy of a child who has not yet learned that adults sometimes carry entire wars behind their smiles. I arrived early that year, which surprised my mother enough that she commented on it twice before I'd even taken my coat off. I helped in the kitchen. I complimented the table setting. I let the afternoon build slow and ordinary, exactly the way I needed it to, with the folder, the real one now, thick with everything Howard and Priya and the medical records had given me, sitting in my car, and a single flash drive with certified copies of everything sitting in my coat pocket, where I could feel its small hard weight every time I reached for a serving spoon. We sat down to eat at 4, the table full in the way it hadn't been since before my grandfather's stroke, and for the first 20 minutes, I let myself simply be there, present, quiet, watching my family perform its rituals of gratitude and small talk, some part of me still, even then, grieving the version of us that could exist so easily around this table when it wasn't examined too closely. It was Ava who broke the surface, though she had no way of knowing what she was breaking. She disappeared upstairs after dessert, the way kids do at these gatherings, restless with the adults' long, slow conversation, and came back down holding something in both hands like a small, careful offering. A shoebox she'd found in the attic while looking, she said, for the old dollhouse Grandpa said was up there. "Look what I found," she announced, setting the box on the edge of the table, oblivious to the way my mother's face went, for just a half second entirely still. "It's got Grandpa's name on a bunch of papers, and there's a notebook too." My mother's hand moved toward the box almost before Ava finished speaking. A reflex fast and unconcealed, the fastest I had ever seen my mother move in my entire life. "Let me see that, sweetheart, that's just old boring." "I already looked at it," I said. The table went quiet in a way I recognized immediately, the particular silence of a room realizing all at once that something has shifted beneath it. My mother's hand stopped mid-reach. "What did you say?" she said, and her voice had lost, for the first time that day, its practiced lightness. "I said I already looked at it," I repeated, and I stood up and I went out to my car and I came back with the folder, and I set it down on the table next to the shoebox Ava had innocently carried down from the attic, a coincidence so precise it felt, for a moment, like something orchestrated by someone other than the two of us in that room. I didn't raise my voice. I want you to understand that, because I had spent weeks imagining this moment as something loud, something that finally let out everything I'd been carrying since October, and instead what came out of me was quiet, almost clinical, my hands entirely steady on the folder's edge. "This is a certified handwriting analysis," I said, laying the first page in front of my mother, confirming that the signature on the deed you filed in June is not genuine. This is Grandpa's medical record from that exact week, showing he had almost no use of his right hand. This is a visitor log from Cedarbrook showing you were alone with him for 20 minutes during that window. And this, I said, laying down the last page, is a notarization record from Ashcombe Title claiming an in-person signing on a day when the facility's own logs show no one from that office ever visited. I did not say Danny's name. I didn't need to. I watched my father's face go pale, watched Danny 3 seats down, set his fork down very carefully, as though the sound of it touching his plate might be the thing that finally broke the room open. My mother looked at the documents for a long moment without touching them. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone flat, stripped of every warm, practiced register I'd known my whole life. "You've been planning this," she said. "All this time. Sitting at my table, letting me think." "I've been finding the truth," I said. "There's a difference." "He wanted us to have some security," my mother said, and something in her face shifted then, not into guilt exactly, but into something colder, more defended. "You have no idea what it's like to spend 30 years building a family, and then watch one person walk off with the one thing that actually mattered, because your grandfather always did favor the granddaughter who left." "I didn't take anything from you," I said. "You forged a signature on a legal document while an 86-year-old man was recovering from a stroke in a facility 40 minutes from home." "I did what needed to be done," my mother said, and her voice was entirely steady now, almost administrative. "Your grandfather was confused near the end. Everyone knew it. I simply made sure the house ended up where it should have gone from the beginning. It was Danny who broke first, not her." "I didn't know it would be like this," he said, his voice cracking on the last word, and every head at the table turned toward him. "Mom asked me to have Carla process it quickly, quietly, before the holidays got complicated. She said Grandpa had already agreed to it, that it was just paperwork catching up to what he wanted. I didn't ask enough questions. I should have asked more questions." He looked at me, and for the first time in weeks he didn't look away. "I'm sorry, Nora. I let this happen because it was easier than saying no to her." My mother's face at her own son's confession did something I hadn't expected, not anger but a kind of cold, sharp exhaustion, as though she'd been carrying something heavy for so long that even being caught felt, in some strange way, like relief. "Fine," she said, and the word landed in the room like a door closing. "You want the truth. Here it is." She was quiet for a moment, and then she began to speak, slowly at first, then faster, as though something long damned had finally found an opening. "It started the week he had the stroke," she said. "I sat in that hospital waiting room for 11 hours, Nora, not you. I was there before you even got the call, because I'm the one who found out first from his neighbor. And I sat there thinking about 30 years of being the one who managed everything in this family, the birthdays, the holidays, the doctor's appointments, the endless small work of holding people together. And I thought about how none of it, not one bit of it, had ever actually been mine. Your father's name was on the businesses his father helped start. Your name was on the house. I've spent my whole adult life managing a family that never once put my name on anything that mattered. When I went to see him at Cedarbrook that week, I didn't go in planning what happened. I want you to believe that, even if you believe nothing else I say today. I went to see him because I was frightened, and because some old, uncharitable part of me looked at a man whose hands could barely hold a spoon and thought, this is my chance to finally have something be mine. I brought the document already drafted. I told him it was paperwork to help simplify things for the family, and I held his hand steady while he signed it. And I want you to know that in that moment, some part of me actually believed I was helping him, helping all of us, more than I believed I was doing anything wrong. I told myself every week after that I would explain it to you eventually, once enough time had passed that it wouldn't feel like theft. I told myself the house needed proper stewardship, that you'd be too busy with your practice to maintain it, that your father and I could use the security more than you needed the sentiment. I believed my own story more thoroughly than I've believed almost anything else in my life. Right up until a 9-year-old walked downstairs holding a shoebox from an attic I forgot I'd even left it in. I am not going to sit here and cry about it the way you probably expect me to. I did what I did because I spent 3 decades watching everyone else's name go on everything that mattered, and I decided finally, near the end of my father-in-law's life, that I would rather be the villain in a story where I finally had something then remain the invisible woman who managed everyone else's inheritance without ever holding one of her own. The table was silent for a long moment after she finished. My father did not speak. He sat with his hands flat on the table, staring at them, and something in his stillness told me he had known. Not everything, maybe, but enough, and had chosen, the way he always chose, silence over confrontation. Ava, still standing near the table, looked between the adults with the confused, uncertain expression of a child who understands that something important has happened without understanding what. And it was that look, my niece's small, worried face, caught in the middle of a war she hadn't known she was walking into, that finally moved me to speak again. "I'm not doing this in front of her," I said, and I meant it as much for myself as for Ava. "This conversation is over for tonight. The documents stay with my attorney. We'll handle the rest properly, through the courts, not across a Thanksgiving table." I stood and gathered the folder, and left the shoebox exactly where Ava had set it down, and I drove home that night with my hands finally, for the first time in weeks, shaking on the wheel, not from fear, but from the particular delayed weight of finally having said, out loud in front of everyone, the thing I had been carrying silently for 2 months. The legal process took just over 4 months. Priya connected me with a family law attorney named Renata Okafor, who specialized in exactly this kind of estate dispute and who looked at Howard's handwriting analysis, the medical records, and the notarization discrepancy with the calm, satisfied expression of someone who recognized a case that would not require much persuading in front of a judge. We filed to void the June deed on grounds of forgery and lack of capacity. My mother, through her own attorney, initially fought it. A brief, cold few weeks of formal letters and one deposition where she repeated, almost word for word, the version of events she'd given at Thanksgiving, framing herself as a woman who had simply helped her father-in-law finalize his true wishes. But Howard's analysis held up without challenge, and once Ashcombe Title's internal review turned up the notarization discrepancy on their own end, a discovery that resulted in Carla Whitfield's notary commission being formally revoked and her quiet departure from the company within weeks, my mother's attorney advised her, I later learned, that contesting further would only invite the possibility of criminal referral for forgery, something even she wasn't willing to risk. The court restored the property to me under my grandfather's original will. My mother and father were ordered to vacate any claim to the deed, and to cover my legal costs, a detail my attorney told me judges rarely include, unless they find the underlying conduct genuinely egregious. Danny did not fight the case. He gave a formal statement corroborating the timeline, an act that cost him within the month both his job at Ashcombe Title, where his role in expediting the filing, however unwitting he claimed to be, was impossible to overlook once the whole matter became part of the public record, and for a long stretch afterward any real closeness with our mother, who has not, as far as I know, spoken to him since the deposition. My mother lost more than the house. She lost the version of herself she'd spent 30 years constructing, competent, generous, the one who held the family together, replaced now, in the small social world of her own community, by a woman known to have forged a stroke patient's signature. She lost, too, the closeness she'd always had with my father, who moved out of their house 6 weeks after the ruling, unable, he told me quietly over coffee one afternoon, to reconcile the woman he'd spent 40 years believing he knew with the one who'd sat across from her own son at a deposition and called what she'd done a kind of rescue. I did not, in the end, need to strike some final dramatic blow. I had built the case slowly, deliberately, in silence, and let the truth do what truth does when you finally stop protecting the people who've misused your patience. It simply arrived, complete, undeniable, and did the rest of the work itself. I moved into my grandfather's house in the spring. I gutted the kitchen first, carefully, the way you'd restore something rather than erase it, keeping the old stove my grandmother had once canned tomatoes on, rebuilding the walls around it so the room could hold both what it had been and what it was becoming. I sold my rental house in town. I have, for the first time in my adult life, a single address that feels entirely unambiguously mine. Ava still visits sometimes. On the weekends her mother, my cousin, brings her out to see the house she once wandered through looking for a dollhouse. She doesn't fully understand even now what she uncovered in that attic. I haven't told her, and I may not for years yet. But I think about her sometimes, climbing those attic stairs with no fear of what she might find, and I think about how much longer it took the rest of us, weighed down by decades of practiced deference, to look as plainly at the truth as a 9-year-old did in about 4 seconds. What strikes me most looking back isn't that my mother forged a signature. It's that she genuinely believed for months that she was rescuing something rather than stealing it. That's the real mechanism at the center of this story. Not simple greed, but 3 decades of invisibility curdling into a conviction that one act of theft could finally even an old, unspoken score. The turning point wasn't the deed itself. It was the 20-minute visitor log entry, proof that opportunity and vulnerability had converged in a single deliberate window, rather than through some ambiguous drift of circumstance. Once that timing was undeniable, everything else, the imitated signature, the false notarization, stopped looking like isolated irregularities and started looking like a plan. The quieter tragedy belongs to Danny, who didn't forge anything himself but made himself useful to someone else's dishonesty, rather than risk the discomfort of refusing her. His cost wasn't a single dramatic betrayal, it was the slow accumulation of small compliances, each one easier because the one before it had already gone unquestioned, until refusing was no longer a muscle he still had. What this story ultimately reveals is how rarely real betrayal announces itself as villainy. It usually arrives dressed as help, as stewardship, as finally taking care of what should have been yours all along, and the people closest to it are often the last to see it clearly, precisely because recognizing it means admitting how long they'd been willing not to look. If there's one thing I'd want you to carry from this, it's that the people who feel most invisible in a family are sometimes the ones capable of the most damage, not because they're cruel, but because invisibility, left long enough, can convince someone that taking is the only way left to finally be seen. What's the one word you'd use for a moment in your own life, when someone you trusted turned out to be building something you couldn't see? Tell me in the comments. And thank you truly for sitting with this story until the end. It wasn't an easy one to tell.